like I said, with any of the topics, I always like to have a macro perspective of, okay, then what? So what? Why do we have intellectual property? In what ways does it help?
Okay.
And it helps massively because then it protects the creative people who spend hours and hours of time and labor and, production and so on. Um, so I actually explained to you at the beginning how I got to know about your work and about you. It was through an article that you participated in. So you participated in the analysis of a fascinating article titled "On les dupes." It sheds light on how younger generations seem more accepting of dupes. Could you share the key insights behind it and why they are more accepting, it seems?
I this for this article, basically it drew on my experience as a professor. And when I say that, being a professor really feeds my practice as a lawyer and also as a researcher, it feeds all the other, like it's three parts of a of my world, and they all feed each other. And I noticed for, I would say, the past 2-3 years, that students, the topics that students bring up and how they react, because keep in mind, I often teach in programs where I have a lot of creators. I teach to a lot of fashion students. I teach to luxury management students. So these are people who really appreciate the creative aspects of it. And they see on their schedule that they have a law class and they think, oh, good grief, no, law, this is going to be horrible. Hopefully, I don't make it too horrible for them. And as I say, I'm not there to make lawyers out of them. I'm here to teach them the importance of it within their jobs. They're going to have to deal with these issues at one point. And if they don't, if they bury their head in the sand, then it's going to cost them a lot of money down the line. So when I talked to my students at length, and I tried to understand what their relationship is with the notion of copying, copycat, piracy, you name it. Basically, the word that kept creeping up in the past, I would say 2-3 years, dupe, all over the place. And so it really started this year. I started having a much more serious conversation saying, okay, well, you mean dupe, but what's the difference between a dupe and a counterfeit? Because let's be very clear, as far as I'm concerned, as a lawyer, when it comes to the legal definitions of what a counterfeit is, a dupe is a counterfeit most of the time, right? It fulfills that definition pretty obviously. But for some reason, the students were like, oh, no, it's not the same. Oh, no, it's not the same. A counterfeit and a dupe is not the same. And
Oh,
so, yes. And so I challenged them, obviously. And I wanted to understand how they define the difference between the two. Um, and basically the reason for dupes is social media, full stop. Like that's the reason. That's the caisse de résonance. That's kind of like that big giant boom box. And the hashtag culture, where you need short, quick, effective words to define things. And dupe, to me, is a lovely new word that just makes counterfeiting positive. It sounds and talking to students about it felt like they were circumventing the system. So there's an act of rebellion slightly in it, but it's not a counterfeit because it's a dupe. The words are different. So what the whole concept behind it is different. And companies themselves are saying, oh, it's a dupe. But when I take them through the legal definition, they're like, oh, maybe. But what I found the most important, other than the legal definition of what constitutes a counterfeit or not, is that kind of morphing of vocabulary to make something that in fact is illegal into something acceptable. Um, and I think it goes hand in hand with the sheer volume of counterfeiting, because there is so much counterfeiting. And let's go back to the luxury industry. There is so much counterfeiting that luxury companies, they have to choose what they're going to fight against. Like, you can't combat counterfeiting all over the place. There's just too much of it going on all the time. So you have to be, and your finances, your legal teams have, very often in the luxury industry, have, you know, quite good funds, but they wouldn't have enough to combat every single piece of counterfeiting all around the world. So you have to be very strategic. And don't forget, depending on the country where you are, you may or may not have intellectual property protection over certain things. So you need to be strategic. So you can't combat every form of copying. You have to choose. Is it going to be a sheer volume where all of a sudden it's flooding a market, like on a national scale or on a regional scale, and so it is devaluing your own product that is flooded amongst very cheap knockoffs? Or are you combating very, very high level, top-notch, excellent quality grade counterfeits? And there are multiple strategies, and sometimes it's not just one or the other, it's multiple. But at the end of the day, the world is flooded with fakes. And we're talking about luxury products. I think, if I remember my numbers correctly, it's approximately about 8-9%, 10% maybe, of counterfeits around the world. I think it's lower than 10, have to do with the luxury industry. And you can imagine the sheer volume just of that. And I'm not even going into the pharmaceutical industry. I'm not even going into, I don't know, the toy industry, what, you name it. If there's a market for something, there's obviously going to be a fake. So if there's a market for the real, there's a market for the fake. So going back to that question of dupe, I think it's that social media era of youth activism, of like, we're circumventing the big, you know, the big expensive thing, and we're finding a cheaper version that works for me, as my students say. But it started in the beauty industry, and now it's just expanding. The word has become this kind of catch-all phrase. But I have to check my students, and I have to take them through the legal definition. I was like, well, no, by definition, it's a counterfeit. If there is an intellectual property right that is being infringed upon, it's a counterfeit. So I think the dupe culture is a mix of all that. It's a mix of social media, the sheer volume of counterfeit that needs to be basically sold all around the world, and that idea of activism, or of a good bargain, because we all love a good bargain, right? We all want to buy something at the correct price. And so, yeah, you've got that notion, that very rebellious streak that I often see in my students. They're usually in their mid-20s. And yeah, it's troubling to me. I'm not going to lie. I think you need to know what you're buying. And this, to me, refers back to, honestly, being an aware consumer. And it has, particularly when you're talking about cosmetics, it has health. To me, it has health consequences. The packaging may be made to look kind of like the same mascara you buy, and it's a cheaper version, and it's exactly the same because the brush is the same. Doesn't guarantee that the product itself is, you know, as clean or as sanitary, or as, you know, doesn't contain products that you wouldn't put on your eyes, for example. Who knows?
Yeah. So do you think this acceptance of dupes varies across, for example, cultures or generations or genders, or maybe even industries?
And I think it has to do, if we're going back to luxury and luxury dupes, there's another thing I didn't mention, was the question of soft luxury. That appeared to me, soft luxury really kind of became a catchphrase and a type of line and multiple products, and during COVID, and people, you know, going back, having to stay inside their homes, and the trademark was less important, but it was more about the fine fabrics, or you know, a candle that was of very good grade quality, etc. So I found that interesting as because it was less about the brand that was on it, even though you know where the brand comes from, but more about the quality. And I found that was a good thing to have, and as a kind of renaissance of not just the brand, but also the quality. But very soon after, we delved into the dupe because it was kind of looked the same, wasn't the same brand on it. You can kind of guess it's the same packaging. Boom, Bob's your uncle. It has to be kind of the same thing. When we talk about dupes today, I think, and culturally speaking, it also depends on how people view luxury. So the definition of luxury will be very different culturally. I don't know. Middle Eastern notions of luxury are not necessarily the same as in Latin America, or not the same as in certain parts of Southeast Asia, for example. And it has a consequence on what types of products or services people go towards, right? But it doesn't change that as long as there's a market for the real, there's going to be a market for the fake. So to me, the definition of counterfeit, and that's where I'm a bit more strict when I put my lawyering hat on, if it's an infringement on an existing valid intellectual property right, it's a counterfeit. So regardless of where you are in the world, you have intellectual property law. And if you have an intellectual property right that protects a luxury product, a luxury service, it could be an airline, it could be, you name it, cars or hotels. If there's an infringement of an existing right, then you've got a counterfeit. So I would say that the relationship it has with luxury, the definitions of luxury may change from place to place, but it really kind of gives you the idea of what people will be consuming in one place other than another. But at the end of the day, intellectual property is all the same. If you've got an IP right and someone infringes upon it, then it's a counterfeit.
And do you think how has AI actually challenged the traditional notions of intellectual property? Especially in fashion, in the fashion world.
The issue with AI, and obviously, I'm a bit of a broken record because everyone's saying that it's changing everything, and it is. We're really at a turning point in our humanity, really. I'm going to take the example of fashion. AI, the big question that I have is when it comes to the notion of originality. Originality, if you look at copyright protection, for example, to have copyright protection, your work, whatever form it takes, needs to be original. And it is challenging, AI is challenging our entire human notion of what originality is. There are entire PhDs written on originality and the notion and the definition of originality. But further than the legal definition of what originality is, and a general definition you sometimes have around the world is originality means that something bears the stamp of the author's personality, which I find is beautiful. The idea that, I don't know, if you look at a specific type of dress, and it will bear the stamp of, I don't know if you know Iris van Herpen, for example, who has very distinctive design. So, that is definitely an Iris van Herpen dress, or that is a definite, I don't know, name your designer dress, right? So AI is challenging that. And more than law, if something challenges what originality is, I think that humanity has a big, big question hanging over its head, because originality is, I think, a massive drive in creativity. If you consider that originality is the stamp of your personality, but a machine or an algorithm can amass this much of information in 2 seconds and spit 500 different options out for you. Where are we as humans? What does it say about a designer? What does it say? And will that change the definition of luxury? Actually, I think it will. I think that we will come to appreciate things that are made in a lot more time. I think our notion of time, our notion of creativity, our notion of originality, I think humanity has a beautiful way in terms of crisis of, not that AI is a crisis, but in terms of big turning points, we have the capacity to rise above. Maybe it's just wishful thinking, but I'm wondering if, faced with all this AI and all this spitting out of options, we aren't going to have a newfound appreciation to things that take time, that take grit, that take an immense amount of calm and thought process and of years of into the making, as a reaction to that. Maybe that's what I hope more than what I, yeah. But it's a thought process. But in right now, if you think of the fashion industry, G.W. Anderson just got named as creative director for Dior today. If you and not just for men, just for the entire house, which is extremely rare. And I don't think it's been done since Christian Dior himself at the time in the 50s. So it's a huge deal. He has to churn out how many collections a year? 10 just for women, with haute couture, ready to wear, summer, blah, the intermediary collections, the cruise, the bridal, the you name it. It's an insane amount of collections to spit out in 1 year. And that's just for women's wear. You add menswear on top of that. And then fulfilling the orders of people who order the clothes. That's insane. And I don't know how one human being can do that all. And he doesn't do it all. He has a whole army of people and to help him out. But I think we're going to, because AI is going to do things so much faster and so much volume, I feel that humanity at one point is going to have to take a breath and going to have to think, okay, you asked me at the beginning, what is your definition of luxury? And I think that maybe at one point in time, if everything goes too fast and if everything is in too much volume, I will have a newfound appreciation for something that is unique, that I know will not be replicated 10,000 times, and that has and time has been spent on it, if that makes sense. But that's just my opinion. I don't know. Practically speaking, AI is here to stay. But to me, it really questions the central tenet and understanding of what originality is, and intellectual property really rests on that notion of originality.
One of the ideas I find really interesting, and I love reading about it, is the concept of the French institutions like Bibliothèque Nationale that have a purpose of protecting, and the approach of the idea of preserving fashion history and protecting cultural property, really. Could you share more about your work with the Bibliothèque Nationale?
Absolutely. So I don't work there anymore, but I had a basically kind of, I guess you could say a fellowship there. A fellowship at the Bibliothèque Nationale, and they asked me to come in because they had a lot of legal archives that they were going to start working on. And they wanted someone to help them, guide them as to, because they are specialized in archives and in archival work. They're not lawyers. So they needed help understanding what types of documents they were dealing with. And it was obviously a great place also for me to kind of delve a bit more into my research on fashion law and intellectual property law and luxury law, and get access to documents that were just absolute treasures. They have a fantastic approach. They are a public entity, and so their approach is very much this is the cultural basin. This is what our entire culture as a country relies on, right? We have these very rare documents. We have this is a testament of the past, of how we built ourselves, what it means to be what we are today. And I think their idea of it is every country has its unique treasures in its archives, and their role is to protect it. So give access to it, talk about it, have researchers come in, do work on it. And that's kind of where I came in for certain of these legal documents. Honestly, I was like a kid at Christmas. It was the sheer amount of documents, which maybe to a lot of people is just a lot of legal jargon. But I looked into very rare cases of counterfeit goods in the 17th century. And there was a case that had to do with, I think it was engraved muskets. So these were firearms, but that from one of the top artisan makers of firearms in France. Another one had to do with, I think it was violins. A luthier, I'm not sure of the English word for it, but someone who makes violins and guitars and those type of instruments. It was honestly an absolute privilege. It was, and it's an interesting thing because it allowed me to see how France built its history under Louis XIV, the king, the Sun King, so Versailles, etc. How it built its economy on what is we now understand as luxury, and it was a total privilege. I appreciated their take on the fact that the question of protecting these archives was a public duty. And unfortunately, public funds are not as extensive. They're not always as extensive. So I'm also glad that some private entities, such as corporations and companies, undertake the beautiful work of building their own archives. So in the luxury industry in the past, I would say 10, 15 years, I think historically Cartier was one of the first houses to organize and have an in-house archival system, just because they had a sheer amount of photos, documents, drawings, illustrations from the founders of the company. And now most luxury companies or of a certain size will have an archive because they understand that it's a great way to strengthen your DNA. Always remember where you came from and how it started. And I would also say it's a great way to get inspired for the future. So particularly in something like fashion. So if you're a designer and you just arrived at the helm of a new couture house, what are you going to do? You're probably going to go and you're going to immerse yourself in archives, understand, where the house came from, the different collections, how past designers for the house were inspired. It reminds me of how Karl Lagerfeld worked with Chanel, because he is really deeply attached to the Chanel house. And if you look closely at his collections, he would take different things like Chanel apparently was obsessed with astrology, and I think she was a Leo, I think. And so he did an entire collection around astrology and the sign of Leo, and like he got inspired by that. And another point, he had access to her library because her apartment, her library and her books are still available. And so he kind of got infused by the archives and understood what she was like to read, and he got inspired by that for his collections. And I think that's a lovely way of mixing archives, the past, with the future and moving it forward, adding your own streak and moving it forward. Good enough to be recognized as a Chanel, but a Chanel by Karl Lagerfeld, if that makes sense. So the question of archives is key. If I'd like to link that to the question of intellectual property, obviously. And there's a big question when it comes to archives, whether it be at a national level, but also actually, and more importantly, at a private level, like at a corporation level. It's the question of public domain. Because remember what I said, you have intellectual property right, you have your copyright, your patent for a certain amount of time, and then it falls into the public domain. And the idea is that humanity benefits from it. And it really asks the questions of companies who go and have and build their archives out of documents they find or they buy at auctions or wherever from the house, and it's passed, and they put that all into archives. What happens if these archives are kind of left only for people within the house to see? And that's one of the questions that I have. It's an ethical problem more than a legal one. But what happens if you build an archive? You're a fashion house, couture house, you build an archive, or I don't know, high jewelry house, and you build an archive. And a lot of the things in your archives fall into the public domain, but you only give access to it to people within your house, or you gatekeep. And that's an issue that I've had as a researcher, because I've wanted to access archives that are public domain historically, like they've fallen into the public domain, but houses protect them. And so it's difficult to get access to. So that's more of an ethical question. I don't have the answer to that. But I also understand that some archives are very precious and can deteriorate very, very fast. So you can't give access to everyone. I get that. So that's kind of like I'm ending your question with another question, I guess. But I think it's an interesting and important one to talk about, well, or at least a question.
Yes, yeah. No, thank you so much for clarifying this. I mean, to conclude and wrap up our discussion, which, by the way, I think deserves a part 2, because we haven't scratched the surface yet.
My pleasure. Bring it on. I'd love to continue chatting.
And we'll talk offline on a paper that I've actually started working on creative industries and creative output and the role of culture in that as well. But just to wrap up with both of us being quite, involved in the academic world and in the academic aspect of it, while I appreciate that you're also quite deeply embedded in the practice world of IP, what research would you like to see more of? What academic research do you wish there was more of?
Your topic, I'm going to give you a form of research and work. I always find that some of the best research I come across, or the one that makes me think the most, is cross-disciplinary. I think this is why I love having conversations like this, because you ask me questions that make me question my view as a lawyer and as that legal lens. I really think that's where there's a lot still to be done. Some of it is done, but I think there's so much more to do. I mean, I like to say I'm a lawyer. I talk about intellectual property. I talk about trademarks, for example. But if you truly want to understand trademarks, talk to also a sociologist, or talk to someone who specializes in psychology. Can't understand a trademark if you don't understand psychology. Talk to an economist who understands the weight of a value of a trademark or a brand. Talk to someone in marketing, and you'll get different answers. You'll get different points of view. That is the research that I constantly applaud when I come across it. And it's very difficult because, I mean, it definitely does happen, but it depends on the university. And because the funding is very often in silos, you have the law school, you have the this, you have the that. So Thank you so much for inviting me, because this, to me, is the perfect opportunity for paths to cross, for ideas to come up, and by challenging different points of views or challenging different topics and subjects and sciences, that's where I think in the middle of all that is where a lot of creativity lies.
Yes, wonderful. We're definitely going to continue this offline, Geraldine. I just want to say, what can I say? I mean, this was full of insights and lots of enlightenment on areas that many people don't really know about. So thank you so much for all your time and effort taking us through this. And it's been a pleasure talking to you.
My absolute pleasure. Thank you so much.